We are meeting again with Dennis Tucker on the subject of custody evaluations in Utah, and this is a good video because we're starting to get into the real meat of things. It's important for us to have laid the background. We've talked about what a custody evaluation is, just kind of in summary, an overview of that. We've talked about when a custody evaluation might be sought, if there's a dispute over child custody in a parentage or paternity action or a divorce action where the parents are fighting over what kind of custody arrangement they should have, which parent should have custody if there's going to be a fight over sole or primary custody. And we've talked about the process of moving to have a custody evaluator appointed, asking the court to do that, and how that process works.
Right.
Now we're at the point where a custody evaluater has been appointed in the case, and the custody evaluation is going to actually roll forth. Okay? So would you pick us up from there and tell us what happens after the order has been issued by the court saying a custody evaluator has been appointed. And in this case it would be someone like Dennis. So Dennis, you've been appointed as a custody evaluator. You then say, I have accepted the appointment. One thing that people need to be aware of is that if Dennis is chosen, he should be in the loop and know that he's being considered for that so that he's available to do the work. And normally that's what happens. And then you'd say, okay, yeah, I knew you guys were going to ask that I be appointed as custody evaluator. I see that I have now been appointed. Does that mean that you must do the work? No. It means that you can say, yes, I accept the appointment, or sorry, I'm too busy, or something's come up, I can't do this. So you have now accepted the appointment. Tell us what happens from that point, now that everyone knows you're on board and you will be conducting this custody evaluation.
Eric, once I have accepted the appointment, then the next part is payment. And we have to make sure that the payment is taken care of. And so once the payment is received, then the next part is that we set up an orientation. And we set up an orientation for both parts. And in that orientation, we actually orchestrate what's to happen throughout the rest of the evaluation process. And that all the necessary paperwork will be signed, releases of information. So there's that process that takes place. And then appointments will be set up during that orientation where I meet with the parents, and then we'll set up appointments for the children. And so that orientation for us is very important because it allows us to set the plan of the rest of the evaluation.
I'm going to ask you a few questions that, just so you're aware, I already know most of these answers, some of them I don't. But when it comes to an orientation, is that where you bring them into an office? Do you send them a short video, or do you give them a pamphlet to read? What is the orientation? How does that take place?
We have them actually come to the office, and I actually don't do the orientation. That could be Julie, it could be another staff that we have, but it is a very essential part of what we do. It's so that you know what's going on. We orient you to the direction of the evaluation, and so you know the next step. We also set up appointments for the meetings to take place.
Do both parents come to the orientation together?
No.
Okay,
No,
so they don't have to do that.
No.
Okay.
So we have separate orientations, and then the process goes forth from there.
Do you have a contract for them to sign?
There are different papers that we do need signatures on, a contract. We do explain what we're doing, and we also let them know that the result may not go according to how they would like, and so they understand these things in the very beginning. And we do take names, and they sign documents, and so it does become official.
So I would assume there's a contract that's signed recognizing that you do charge a fee and that they're expected to pay the fee, and given what the court may have done, the court may have said mother pays the full fee or father pays the full fee, or the parties divided equally, or even in some cases dad's paying 70% and mom's paying 30%. Whatever that says, you have a contract so that you know and they know what you're to be paid and who's to be paying it.
Correct. And actually before the orientation, much of that is already accomplished, and so the fees aren't just some arbitrary thing. It does depend upon the number of children that are to be included in the evaluation. Are there additional partners that also need to be part of the evaluation? If there is a partner, we also have to connect with that person and evaluate them. So the fees depend upon a number of things, and it's not just one straight fee for all orientations.
So you're talking about a situation where you might have an unwed couple or a separated couple where there's not just mom and dad, but then there's mom and her boyfriend or girlfriend, and then dad and his girlfriend or boyfriend, and then there also might be some collaterals that we will deal with, like if there were a witness to something that was a school administrator or a teacher.
References.
There might be someone that involved, like a daycare provider or something like that. So there can be, like you say, partners, which would be boyfriends, girlfriends. There can be some other people like school administrators or other relatives that might have a lot of interaction with the parties or the kids, things like that.
Correct.
And the more people you're going to deal with, the more expensive it's likely to be, because you're going to be spending more time and more effort on these people.
Yes, if there are additional significant others that are in addition to the two opposing parents, we do have to evaluate them as well.
Okay. Do you know the average prices? I mean, and we're making this in 2020, early 2020, so things can always change. But do you know what you know what you charge? But what's the upfront cost that people usually pay by way of a deposit?
Well, a custody evaluation can be significantly expensive, and they can range from probably $4,000 to $13,000, depending on what takes place.
Okay, and if I've been kind of hard up, I got laid off, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd maybe cut me a deal. I mean, because you don't know how much I care about my kids, and they're my whole world, Dennis. I really need your help here, so I'd really appreciate it if I could give you $800 now and then maybe $800 in a week. Can you do something like that?
No, we cannot.
Yeah. Now, Dennis could probably tell you this, but I'm going to venture a guess. It's not that Dennis is without feelings and compassion. It's just if he made an exception for you, he'd have to make the exception for everyone, and then he'd never see a penny. Because there'd be somebody that would be willing just to whittle him down to nothing, and he'd just be a victim of his own compassion. So please understand, you have to pay the custody evaluator. And if you're going to say, well, don't you care about my kids, and aren't you worried that my kids are going to be killed or something like that? The answer is, look, it's not my concern. I have to do a job, and I'm not responsible for your family or those sorts of things. This is something in order for me to do anything, to be any good to anybody, I have to eat, and I have to be paid to do it.
Correct, and frankly, all the fees are taken care of before we ever have the orientation meeting.
Okay.
So that's part of it.
So I understand it's expensive, and what happens if somebody never pays? So let's assume it's a 50-50 proposition, and somebody pays his or her half, and the other parent never does. Can you do half an evaluation?
No. No, in fact, we have to wait, and things are on pause until the whole thing is paid. And we've been in situations where that delay has occurred for months. So we have half the evaluation paid for, and we cannot even begin until the other half is paid for. And sometimes that involves going back to the court and saying, hey, we have some holdups here. Your Honor, this is what's going on. And so we do keep the courts aware of what's going on, but we cannot begin the evaluation until the whole thing is paid for.
Well, why not just, I paid my half, so why don't you just conduct your interview with me? Why can't you do that?
Because it would not be a valid custody evaluation if we only have one side. And so if we can't begin and have the whole thing, we wait until we can begin.
I know. Well, if I've paid my half already, can't you write a report saying that good old Eric paid his half, and he's been reliable, and he's been consistent, and I'm going to report that? Could you do me that solid and just say, hey, I got the money from Eric, and that suggests that he can be trusted? I mean, yeah?
Well, it would suggest a reliability.
Yeah, so I just need you to tell the court. I just need you to write, here, I've already got this letter right here, just sign at the bottom acknowledging that I've paid my half and that I'm a reliable guy you can count on.
That does not constitute a custody evaluation, which is what we're ordered to do. Anything less than that is not according to a court order. So we would not be able to do something like that.
All right. I'm glad that we've cleared that up, because that can be such a stumbling block. It's just getting the payment made and getting the contract signed. And then, do you use an intake form? I know that some custody evaluators do. They'll have a thing where they'll add a piece of paper that will say, what's your name, and what are your kids, and how much education do you have, and do you have a criminal record, and tell me about your relationship with your family. And do you do anything like that with people?
Actually, that takes place in part of the interview process. That becomes a psychosocial history, and where we actually get the information and about the, in this case, the parent. We will do the same thing with the opposing parent, and to some extent even with the children that later come in, or even with the significant others. So all this is part of the fact-finding, information gathering. I also get their view of why this is happening. What is their understanding of why this evaluation is necessary? So I do hear the sides, and also at some point gather the evidences that they might have to support their claims.
Well, I happen to have 800 pages of really good dirt on my spouse. So would you like to see all 800 pages of that?
Send it, and we will look at it, and we will, if you have, we do need evidences, so if you have some, bring them.
Well, I'd really like you to know just how deeply I care. I really care a lot. I love my kids. They're my whole world. Is that useful information to you?
It can be useful, but we also need validation. It's nice that those things are said, but do you have doctor's visits, and do you have receipts, and do you have things to substantiate these claims that you are making? That becomes very important for us.
Now I'm going to move on to the additional things that you might do. I think a lot of people think, all right, this is where I'm finally, and so I'm a man, so I'll talk about some of the things that men talk about. I will sprinkle in some concerns that women and mothers often bring up that may be kind of unique to them. But it's like, okay, I'm finally going to get some tests and prove that my wife has borderline personality disorder, right? Right?
Well,
that's what part of the custody evaluation is, right? You're going to do some psychological testing,
correct.
And I'm going to finally get to show the court that my wife has borderline personality disorder, like I've been telling everybody for years.
We do take evidences. If you say your wife is borderline, that doesn't necessarily mean anything to us. It has to be things that we observe. Now, we could get records, possibly from past counseling appointments or other types of things. Information could be used, but it needs to be validated. It needs to be credible sources. This needs to be substantiated evidences, and so not just feelings or claims.
Well, yeah, but I mean, what I'm going to ask you to do as the custody evaluators, I'm going to have you, like, if you are licensed to do it, then I'm going to have you diagnose her, and I know that if you're not, then you can hire other experts to help you, right, like psychologists and things like that. So you're going to hire a psychologist, and that psychologist is going to do the diagnosis, and I'm going to get borderline personality disorder finally, right?
We do diagnose. That is part of the evaluation, and it may not necessarily go the way that you anticipate.
But it's so, she's got borderline personality disorder. I've read many articles online, and I've looked at several checklists, and I know I'm not an expert, but you're going to get an expert, and by the way, I wrote in my intake stuff that I think she has borderline personality disorder, and I want you to establish that.
It may not go the way that you want, and we are impartial. So present your evidences, but they must be evidences, not just hearsay, not just opinions.
Okay.
We will look into that. We will weigh the matters out. We will make forensic judgments based upon the evidences that we have, but we don't necessarily play into popular psychology or other types of things that go on.
Okay, and so, and you can see that I was being facetious here, but you know, a lot of you will we know this, a lot of you will pin your hopes on, it's like, I have my own views, I have my own biases, my own beliefs, and this custody evaluator is going to verify everything. Well, I can tell you right now that, one, you may be wrong, and so there's just no borderline personality disorder there in the first place, or it may be that the evaluator might say, Actually, I did find some evidence of some personality disorders or some interesting things, but they're not enough for me to conclude this parent is unfit.
We need a preponderance of evidence. We also do psychological testing as part of the evaluation process. That testing becomes important for us. It would help discover some of these traits. In fact, psychological testing is important because it becomes an objective evidence in addition to maybe what one partner might be saying or what maybe a clinical interview may reveal. So that testing is also very important for us.
Now, it's interesting for you to note objectivity is that when it comes to mental health and mental health sciences, there is a lot of subjectivity. It's just the nature of the science itself, right? So you could have two or three different custody evaluators come to, in some cases, very different conclusions. It's not likely, but it could, right?
Typically, it's based upon the evidences presented, which is why we need a preponderance of evidence. And so at some point it can be so perhaps one-sided that it becomes very clear. And if that's the case, then the evidences help actually make the evaluation for us. So we do need evidences, we do understand, we do hear things, but evidences make or break the case.
So there can be close calls where one evaluator might come down on one side and another evaluator, both doing a good job, could come down on the other because there's a certain element of subjectivity, and sometimes people can make a mistake. Sometimes an evaluator can be duped. Is that correct?
Why not?
Yeah.
There is a bit of humanness that comes into the evaluation. We are not robots, but we do evaluate. There are certain standards that we also have to follow. A diagnosis takes place according to criteria. Are the criteria met? So there is subjectivity, there's also a high degree of objectivity, and ultimately evidence speaks for itself. Though evidences could include references, what other people say. Sometimes you might be surprised that the evidences we get from the references given to us by one parent might actually not always support what that parent is saying. And sometimes that might be surprising to them. So these become very important. We do look at school reports. We look at as many evidences as we can, which could include text messages. Be careful what you send out to your opposing partner. These all become evidences that are important for us to evaluate. But we take them together and not necessarily one here or there. We try to get a full picture based upon these evidences.
Could an evaluator ask a parent to submit to a psychosexual evaluation if in the course of the evaluation the evaluator thought that's warranted?
Well, I suppose if it's pertinent to the particular case.
That's what I mean. Let's assume that it didn't get raised in the pleadings, that somebody didn't say one of the parents is sexually abusing children. But then in the course of the evaluation, the evaluator begins to wonder if that is in fact happening, either because of disclosures made by the children or collateral sources, or even by one of the parents, him or herself.
There are various tests out there that can assess for sexual reactivity, and so that would be an additional fee that goes on top of the other things that take place.
Is that something that you have the discretion to choose to do, or would you have to go to the court and ask the court to order that be something you can have as part of the evaluation process?
We can actually make that determination here. It would add to the fee, and there are various psychometric tests that can test for sexual reactivity or the types of things, and so we would be able to, which is part of when we look at the discovery and we find the information and the facts, we find that, for example, if there's aggression or anger or violence, then we can actually choose certain psychometric testing, very telling of this particular area, and so that becomes part of the toolkit that we pull from.
What if you decide that you want a parent to submit to a certain kind of test and that parent objects? I'm embarrassed, or I'm offended, or even something maybe like my religion forbids it or something like that, what would you do with something like that? Let's assume that you said to me, it's like, okay, well, I'd like you to submit to a psychosexual evaluation, and I'll let you guys look this up, a penile plethysmograph. And I might go, like, are you crazy? I'm not going to do that. That's, you know. Or I might even have legitimate, it's like, I don't know if I believe that's even a valid test, or something like that. What would happen? And I'm talking about any set of tests. If I said as one of the parents, I'm not going to do that, I refuse, how does that affect your evaluation?
Well, we would make note of it. We're not going to necessarily force someone to do a test that otherwise they wouldn't do. However, keep in mind that a refusal may actually come in as a type of evidence that then can be used to help make the assessment.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about what the actual chronology of events is. So we know that there's going to be interviews with the mom and the dad and the children and perhaps the partners you've mentioned and maybe collateral. So could you kind of tell us maybe kind of a generic or common scenario as to how this happens? So once the payment has been made, once your intake forms have been filled out, the orientation's completed, what happens next typically, and how long does it take?
Well, for example, this week I interviewed a mother in a case. The orientation took place last week. So this week I've already interviewed her and had the clinical portion of it. Perhaps next week I'll do the father. At some point the children come in, so we get all this information. And so once we have, and after we have the interviews, we also then call up for the references. We'll actually connect with them. Some of these will be school reports or the types of things. Then we do the information gathering. At some point a home visit is made where actually going into the home and sitting down with the family on one home and then the other. And if that happens to be in another state, then that also is important. So we try to organize all these things, and once we have this, then we actually do some final interviews where we pull the parents aside and meet with them and maybe talk with them about some of these concerns that the other parent has expressed and give them a chance to counter or to explain why some of these things may be happening. And then once we have all these things put together, then we sit down and we review all the evidences that have been given. We sit down and take these, the information gathered from the interview, what the references will say, what the psychometric testing will say, and so then we start to formulate a picture. And in this case, I speak with Julie and we maybe discuss things, and this is what the findings I have, and so based upon this discovery and this information that we've gathered, then we make our assessment. Yeah. And at that point actually create an official document for the court summary settlement report that we do, and then typically I then announce to the court that the fact-finding component has been done, and then at that point then they set up the summary settlement.
Yeah, the 4903 settlement conference comes next. And who's involved with that?
I'm involved, the parents are involved, a commissioner or judge is involved, the lawyers are involved, and we come down and disclose what the findings are. And at that point, we can go forward and talk about what they want to do. It can also be decided that they want to go and actually order an official custody evaluation. And there's a difference between the summary report and the actual custody evaluation. The summary report basically has the nuts and bolts. These are the findings, but without all the explanation.
Oh, and so this is written down sometimes?
Well, I write them down all the time.
Right. Okay, so you're saying that they can either write down a summary report or give a summary report, but that's not the report. They could ask for a formal custody evaluation.
Correct.
And that is a written report.
In fact, standard practice is not to do the actual custody evaluation unless it's requested.
So up till then, all you've done is said, this is what I've done. I've been conducting an evaluation. I've been going through the steps, but at this point I haven't actually conducted the evaluation in final report form unless you ask me to do it. Is that what you're saying?
Unless it's ordered by the court to actually do the custody evaluation report. Now, there is the conference, the summary conference report, but it's not the same as the official custody evaluation.
How much is that going to set you back if you order that?
Well, we have a fee, and I think that the actual write-up of that report is probably $500 for us.
Okay. One last thing I wanted to go over before we finish is that how long do you talk to the parent?
I interviewed the mother this past week, and we were there for probably a couple of hours, 2 to 3, and so that's the first interview.
Okay.
And that's where the psychosexual history is talked about, the reasons behind the need for the evaluation, understanding their past, understanding their view. And so the thing takes place with both parents, and also similar things take place with the children. And so we're talking about a number of hours of direct interview, not necessarily counting the psychometric testing that takes place, which is also something that we'll set up in the orientation or
Okay.
so.
So do you talk to the parents over multiple days? Or do you just have the initial interview for 2 or 3 hours, and then do you also have one that comes up at the end?
Yes, that's the follow-ups. We have one at the end where they are able to then counter or the additional questions that, for example, sometimes we don't know the questions until, oh, we have the information gathered. Here's what the children said, and now we look at these things and we have additional information that we need, and that comes up in the final clinical interview with the parents.
Okay. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.